The California Dreaming podcast is brought to you by Blueberry. There is more to making a podcast than just talking into your mic and hitting publish. You're going to need a little bit more than that. And I'm talking about reliable hosting so your time can be spent working on your show. You want accurate download numbers, you want to see the audience that you're reaching, and you're going to want a web page that is simple and easy to work with. That's why I've chosen to use Blueberry. It's simple media hosting and fully integrated WordPress website. It can't get any easier, especially for someone like me who knows nothing. If you host a show or you're thinking about starting one, visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to give it a try for a month for free. Their dedicated support team will be right there to help you every step of the way. And with 1 month for free using our promo code DREAM, you've got no more excuses to start up that podcast that you keep talking about starting. I hope that all of you in the United States that do celebrate Thanksgiving had a good one. Mine was fine. I went to California and spent time with my daughter and my mom, and it went okay. We don't have a very big family, and the family that my mom does have, my aunts and uncles, it's probably not a surprise if you know me and all that I've mentioned about it that my mom is hardly on speaking terms with any of them. So it was quiet and uneventful. I was glad to get back to working on the show, and I am going to do my best to end 2020 as strong as I can when it comes to getting these episodes out to you and in a timely manner, both here and on Patreon. And if you are looking for ways to help support California Dreaming, there are a couple of things that you can do. You can leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts along with 5 stars. I don't always read the reviews because sometimes they're not all that pleasant, and I'm pretty sensitive to that sort of stuff. But I did recently notice that the show, which had hovered around 4.5 stars over the last 3 years, has dropped to 4 stars. So if you haven't left us a review, the rating sure could use a little boost if you have access to Apple Podcasts. Listenership has stayed consistent, but it's taken a slight dip as we've continued to struggle through the COVID-19 pandemic. People who might be struggling with their work situation, or if you're not commuting or listening to podcasts as much as you used to, that may all have an effect on it. It's also the holiday season, and I don't know how much or how little that impacts listening, but I am hoping that we're going to be able to turn a corner come 2021. I know the new year doesn't necessarily mean things are going to magically get better, but it always seems like a good spot to decide that we're going to make some new goals and try to live up to them. And I'm not a New Year's resolution kind of person. But what I am going to try to do is go strong through the month of December when it comes to content and productivity. I want to see a boost in listens and downloads, both here on the regular show as well as on Patreon, and hopefully be able to carry that over into the new year when all of us are ready to take on whatever challenges are waiting for us in 2021. 2020 has been one of the most difficult years of my life, separating from my husband, moving states, moving away from my daughter, my only child, and all of this in the midst of this coronavirus. And I guess the upside of all of the quarantining and mandatory stay-at-home orders and shutdowns of businesses is that it really didn't have all that much effect on me because I was going through my own personal issues already. This is my favorite time of year, and even if I don't let any of what's going on in my personal life creep into my thoughts and take over, there's still this virus that is hanging over all of us, which I'm hoping comes under control very soon. The best and only way that I can think of to make myself feel better, and hopefully you guys to feel better, is to just focus on doing the best that I can here with the show. And of course, I'm always happy and honored to see new people joining in support of the show on Patreon. So for this week, I'd like to thank Mo P for raising their pledge to the next tier, as well as Ryan H, Gabriel D, Chandra C, Maria D, Raven P, Barbara C, Celeste S, Lynette C., and Christine F. for joining Patreon and supporting the production of California Dreaming. This is the only income I make, and we don't do ads, and we plan to keep it that way. So if you'd like to help support this and access exclusive episodes, and almost all of the episodes are full length, just like the regular show, it's only $1 a month. And we're still in the middle of our exclusive series. We're keeping the subject matter under wraps, but we already have 7 parts in. Almost every part is nearly 2 hours long, if not more. And it is one of the deepest dives we've ever taken into a story. And that is available to everyone at all membership levels on Patreon. So I think it's worth it. All right, let's get on to today's story. Today's episode was recommended to me by listener Nate B. So thank you for reminding me of this case. I remember watching this on TV. And thank you for all the other cases that you're always bringing to my attention and to all of your posts on our Facebook group. So today, our story involves a number of themes, as do many of the ones we talk about on our show. We're going to come to know a young couple who, in very short order, met, fell in love, became pregnant, married, and split up in a relatively short period of time. It started off as a love story, but quickly turned into a hate story. And we're going to see that the impetus for the hate stemmed from the involvement of the in-laws, specifically the mother and father of the bride. It's going to be said that this marriage was never between two individual people, that it was between him, her, and her parents, especially when it came to their young child. Some people are lucky and hit the jackpot when it comes to in-laws. I don't think I did too bad in that department. I don't think I can say the same for my husband, as there were certainly a great deal of problems that flared up between us because of my mom. And as I read through the details of this case, some aspects of what was going on here with the mother of the bride, I was really feeling it. I'm sure that there are some of you out there listening who got a bum deal when it came to the in-laws. And I'm also sure that many of you have some stories that you could share about that. But how far is too far when it comes to the in-laws meddling in your relationship? Where do you draw the line? And is it ever worth giving up on your marriage because you simply can't do it anymore? Everybody's story, everybody's experience is unique. I know that I was determined, no matter how much my mom despised my husband, that I would do everything I could to make sure that she had as little impact on our lives as possible. It was tough, and I have to hand it to my husband for putting up with her for as long as he did. And even though he and I are in a rough patch right now, and even though we are in a rough patch right now in our relationship, that is a thing that's between him and me. But I do know that there was a great deal of damage that I caused because of the manner in which my mother hovered over my life. When she'd snap, I'd snap. And sometimes he was in the crosshairs. He understood, thank goodness, the stress and the pressure that was on me. But I'd be lying if I said that it didn't take its toll on us. And that is part of what we're going to see happen as our story progresses here today. But it wasn't a slow burn. The emotions and the downfall of the marriage occurred relatively quickly in this 168th episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the Persian violets. Our story today takes place in idyllic Santa Barbara, California. It is a coastal city, and what sets it apart from most of the other California coastal cities is that the coastline of Santa Barbara faces south, and it is the largest section in the state that does that. The climate is often compared to being similar to the Mediterranean, and Santa Barbara is often referred to as the American Riviera. While it is an ideal place to live and it is a popular tourist destination, Santa Barbara is not immune to its fair share of crime. Detective Greg Sorensen, who worked for the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department back in March of 2004, at that time his office was in charge of an investigation involving a young man named Jarrod Davidson. At the time, Jarrod was 27, and he was the father of a 3-year-old named Malia. And he and Malia's mother, a young woman named Kelly, had already been married and long divorced. Kelly Davidson had made the claims that Jarrod was sexually abusing their daughter. Kelly said something to the effect that she became suspicious that something wasn't right with Malia, and that she was asked if her father was doing things or touching her in a way that he shouldn't be, and that the then 3, almost 4-year-old said yes, that her father did do those things. Kelly then turned around and told her parents about what Malia had said to her. But here, they did something that I found to be really suspicious from the start. Instead of Kelly going to the sheriff's office, or instead of her parents encouraging Kelly to go to the sheriff's office to file a report of the suspected abuse herself, Kelly went ahead and told Malia's preschool teacher about her suspicions. And that was her parents' idea for her to tell the teacher instead of going to authorities. And the reason they did that is because they knew that the teacher would be a mandated reporter, as required by law, to report any suspected abuse that they see. Now, like I've said right away, this made me suspicious as soon as I read this detail. It made absolutely no sense to me for Kelly and or her parents, or all 3 of them together, to not march themselves down to the sheriff's office straight away and make this report for themselves in person. And it's a little iffy to me because, well, I've been a preschool teacher. And if a parent told me that they suspected the other parent was sexually abusing their child, I would definitely question why they weren't filing a police report themselves or why one hadn't already been filed. Honestly, if I knew the circumstances of what was going on between divorced parents, and I've heard a lot of stories coming from both sides, there are times when mom and dad aren't even ever in each other's presence, like the daycare had become the drop-off and pick-up point, the place where they hand off the visitations, right? Parents tend to share what's going on at home, especially if a divorce was particularly acrimonious. I'd be very cautious about reporting abuse that I did not witness evidence of for myself. To me, mandated reporting meant that if I were to say, for example, change one of the toddler's diapers and I saw red marks on this child's butt or inexplicable bruises, things like that, that would lead me to believe that the child was being abused. And then I'd go ahead and I'd have my boss take a look at the injuries, and the decision would then be handed over to my superiors as to what steps to take next. I don't think a mother would tell me that they suspected the father was sexually abusing the child without having gone to the police for themselves, and then would expect me to be the one to report that abuse. Because what it comes down to is I didn't actually see any evidence of it or witnessed it. And if I'm really being honest, I don't think I would be thinking very highly of this mother in her failure to report the abuse herself. And I would even start to suspect that the mother was attempting to drag me and the preschool into the middle of her problems with her ex-husband, if you know what I mean. Because I would think if the mom was comfortable enough to share something as serious as that with me, that I would probably be pretty familiar with their situation, the divorce, and the state of their relationship. Once you get to know a kid really well, you can even kind of tell when they've been with mom and when they've been with dad. It's not always a bad thing per se, it's just there's a difference, you know? Anyway, to me, Kelly's parents giving her the suggestion to tell the preschool teacher instead of going directly to police I believe was a tactic to add some legitimacy to the accusations that Jarrod was sexually abusing his daughter. We will come to find that the relationship between Jarrod and Kelly and Jarrod and her parents was incredibly toxic. Perhaps Kelly having come up with these types of serious accusations, and it's worth mentioning that they were in the middle of a very, very contentious custody battle too. That her coming up with these accusations might be a component of trying to win that battle. As a matter of fact, the custody battle lasted longer than the marriage itself. Coming with these types of serious accusations when a custody battle is being fiercely fought is kind of suspicious, or can be looked upon as being suspicious. It would come off as a ploy to win full custody and to possibly even have Jarrod thrown in jail and likely lose contact with his daughter forever. So the accusations had to come from an unbiased party that really had no dog in the fight, right? And who better than Malia's preschool teacher? Did Kelly and her parents want Jarrod completely out of their lives and Malia's life? Heck yeah, they did. As a matter of fact, they were on a mission to make sure that he would be. So Malia's preschool teacher, based on what Kelly had said, reported the suspected sexual abuse, and Jarrod came under what would turn out to be a 4-month-long investigation headed up by Detective Sorensen. So in that time, Detective Sorensen had become very familiar with Jarrod, his ex-wife, and her mother and father. In an interview with NBC, Detective Sorensen discussed how Jarrod was brought down to the sheriff's department, that he was pretty nervous and uneasy about being there, but also very confused and taken aback by the whole thing. After all, Jarrod was a young man who had never been in any kind of trouble with the law. So when he was made aware of why he was there being questioned, that there had been some allegations made and a report made with Child Protective Services that his daughter had indicated that he was touching her inappropriately, he was completely mystified by it all and was willing to cooperate fully with the investigation, which included Jarrod agreeing to being subjected to a polygraph examination. However, when the questions began meandering towards the manner in which he was alleged to have abused Malia, what little confidence Jarrod had in himself and his answers somewhat crumbled. He was shaken up by the questions, and he was having a difficult time finding the right words to answer or even how to answer. And unfortunately for Jarrod, he failed at least one of the polygraph exams, though I'm not clear on how many he was actually given, but it was noted that he failed one of them. But fortunately for Jarrod, law enforcement were not exactly ready to brand Jarrod a child sex abuser and throw him in jail. As Detective Sorensen explained, there have been many a time when a person is not guilty of a crime, but also happened to fail a polygraph exam for whatever reason. So luckily, Jarrod was given the benefit of the doubt, and in subsequent polygraph examinations, he did pass. Even though he failed one, he passed one, and it seemed as though the whole thing was a wash for the cops, and they didn't really go hard on Jarrod. They didn't pressure him or interrogate him into a confession, but the investigation continued forward anyway. And after a forensic psychologist that specialized in working with children sat down and spoke to Malia told the psychologist that her dad did not touch her in inappropriate ways. So as I said, after 4 months of looking into this and getting to know Jarrod, Kelly, and the family, Detective Sorensen came to the conclusion that there was no abuse going on, that the allegations being made by the mother in this case were deemed unfounded. None of the earmarks of a child being sexually abused were elements of what was going on with Malia, and Jarrod was never charged with any crime related to it. The allegations had been brought up in March of 2004. 4 months later, that would take us into July. That would be when those charges were officially dismissed and the investigation was dropped. But by July 9th, 2004, Jarrod Davidson would be dead. On the night of July 9th, 2004, around 11 o'clock that evening, the first of 2 911 calls came into the Santa Barbara Emergency Communications Center. In the apartment complex where Jarrod lived, people were settling in for the evening. Some had already gone to bed. Some were waiting for the last news broadcast of the night before the talk shows were to come on. The caller reported hearing something that sounded like a single gunshot, followed by a person screaming. The second call came in just a minute or so later. This caller was in the courtyard of the complex, having been jolted out of bed by the sound of a gunshot, only to come outside to find a young man laying on the ground near the entrance to his own apartment in a pool of blood. The young man was Jarrod. Nothing about this violent crime made any sense from the beginning. This was the unlikeliest of places for a shooting like this to occur, and Jarrod was the unlikeliest of victims. He was polite and quiet, somewhat private and to himself. He was kind and unassuming, but this shooting, it was cold, and it was calculating, and it was brutal, and it looked as if Jarrod was specifically targeted. This was no ordinary random shooting where Jarrod was struck accidentally by a stray bullet. The investigation revealed that he was shot from a relatively close proximity, though it wasn't point blank. The shooter wasn't standing in front of him. It was from a short distance away, but the rifle used to fire the single bullet was high-powered. So much so that the bullet struck Jarrod in the upper torso, traveled through and through, exiting out his back. It went into his apartment and through a wall and into an adjacent apartment and came to rest in his neighbor's shower. Jarrod bled to death on his front porch. He was only 27 years old. For lack of a better word, Jarrod's death was nothing short of an execution. Malia, who was just a few weeks shy of her 4th birthday, had lost her father, and Richard and Susan Davidson had lost their son. It just so happened that Detective Sorensen, he lived a few miles away from Jarrod's apartment complex, and just like Jarrod's neighbors, he had been settling in, getting ready to call it a night, when he actually heard the gunshot go off all the way over at his house. With his experience as a detective and with various guns, he knew from the sound that he heard that it was indeed a high-powered rifle that made that sound, and it was somewhat of a distance away. It's just not something that you would regularly hear at that hour of the night in Santa Barbara, and really at any hour for that matter. So Detective Sorensen immediately felt like something was very, very wrong, and he would become the lead investigator on this case. Witnesses who lived at the apartment, Jarrod's neighbors, several of them had reported that they saw 2 people fleeing from the scene immediately after they heard the gunshot. And it wasn't just the neighbors in his complex, but others that lived nearby or next door. And all of them were certain one of the people fleeing was a man and one of them was a woman. Something strange did stand out to first responders when they got there, however, the paramedics and the officers. They noticed that there was a plant in a pot that appeared to have been held by Jarrod and dropped to the ground as he was shot. And it was there between his legs where he died. With the plant was a small greeting card, the kind that you can pick up at the florist or the floral area of a grocery store. And you put it on one of those small plastic stakes that you could stick into the pot with the plant when you give it as a gift, right? The stake had that card on it, and it had pre-printed on the card the words "To my teacher." And Jarrod's name was written on the card with what looked kind of like a thick pen or a marker, but it seemed like the writing was intentionally kind of made to be weird looking, And Jarrod's name was also spelled incorrectly on the card. Jarrod's name is spelled Jarrod, but on the card it was spelled Jared. The letters, they were kind of ornate, like the person was trying to be creative, or they, like I said, they were simply trying to disguise their own handwriting. Whatever the case was, two things stood out. That the card was for teacher, but Jarrod wasn't exactly working as a full-fledged teacher in that capacity quite yet, and that the fact that his name was misspelled. The plant had purple flowers or blossoms. They were Persian violets. While the pot of violets may have seemed inconsequential in the moment, just an artifact of something much more serious going on, which was the execution-style murder of Jarrod Davidson, that potted plant would prove to be the key that would unlock the answer as to who in the world would have done this to Jarrod. It's like the saying goes, the devil is in the details. And luckily for Jarrod's family, there just so happened to be a keen deputy who just so happened to make an earnest observation when his eye caught a glimpse of those Persian violets next to Jarrod's body. And I will circle back to that in a moment. As soon as Detective Sorensen found out who the victim was, that this was the same Jarrod Davidson that he had just finished investigating for 4 months regarding those allegations that he was sexually abusing his daughter, Sorensen's thoughts immediately went to Jarrod's ex-wife. In the time that he was investigating, he came to find out just how bitter that custody battle was over Malia. There had been an occasion when Malia told her dad that her grandmother hated him. That was a thing that compelled Jarrod to go back to court and file for full custody of his daughter. He was very angry and disappointed that his former mother-in-law was attempting to do what is essentially brainwashing his own daughter against him. So he went straight to court and filed for custody. And not that that battle wasn't already ongoing at this point, but when Malia told her dad that her grandmother hated him, the battle was really on then. As for Detective Sorensen, well, a suspect rocketed to the top of his list before Jarrod's mother and father were even made aware of what is every parent's worst nightmare. Richard and Susan Davidson's phone rang pretty early the following morning, the morning after their son had been gunned down. He had been gone by then for almost 8 hours. 8 hours while this couple were likely resting easy. Was going to be the last night of easy rest that they'd have for a very, very long time. They'd wake up to that call that nobody ever wants to get. Why they were not notified in person by detectives, I don't know. But from what I read, it is my understanding that it took some time to track them down. And for whatever reason, they were sadly notified by phone that Jarrod had been murdered. The Davidsons, they immediately knew. They didn't know exactly who, but they knew it was they that did it. They killed him. They finally killed him. And they were talking about their former daughter-in-law and her parents. They all had just accused their son of sexually abusing their grandchild, and when that did not work, when that didn't cause the courts to deny him custody or visitation, or even bring about any criminal charges because the accusations were baseless and really they were fabricated, let's just put that out there right now, they all decided to resort to Plan B. They would have to see Jarrod dead in order to get him out of their lives for good. So they would never have to share custody of Malia with him ever again. Detective Sorensen was the lead on Jarrod's murder case. After all, he had literally just closed the case on the child abuse accusations. It had just been days. He had barely filed that away when the young man he'd been investigating, getting to know over the past 4 months, suddenly turned up murdered. Coincidence? Not so much in the world of true crime, am I right? Now, I don't know the ins and outs of the investigation into the abuse case that was filed against Jarrod, but we have to assume, and you listening have likely assumed, and we can assume that Detective Sorensen also assumed that Kelly and her parents were not the biggest Jarrod fans in the world. As a matter of fact, if they actually went so far as to attempt to file charges against Jarrod of abusing his child, I think we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that the three of them probably hated him. As soon as Detective Sorensen found out Jarrod was his victim, he knew that the case he had just closed was suddenly ripped wide open again with this brutal murder. When the sexual abuse investigation was going on, Detective Sorensen became very well aware that the battle over custody had grown contentious, and he did entertain the thought that perhaps Kelly, the ex-wife, was so determined to not only win sole custody, but to make sure that Jarrod would have as little contact with their daughter as possible, that she would go so far as to fabricate those sexual abuse accusations. It's happened before. And dreamers, it's happened to a very good friend of mine. His ex-wife, along with her parents, sort of a very similar situation. They had come to despise my friend so much that they began this years-long campaign against him, charging him with sexually abusing both their son and daughter. I'm not sure how long the official investigation went on, but the visits with Child Protective Services, getting dragged into court, going to see therapists, and, after all of that, my friend never lost his visitation and he never had to be supervised, and nothing was ever done to intervene or take the kids away from him permanently. But the court system never really seemed to be able to finalize this case because every single time one of the ex-wife's accusations fell flat, she'd come up with another one. And it was awful, it was painful, it was costly, and this went on for years. It's still going on. But he kept fighting and fighting and fighting. The court systems, the judges, they were not working very well in favor of the father in this case. And I mean, well, maybe I'm biased here because he's been my friend for more than 25 years, and I've known him for a long time, long before his ex-wife ever knew him. So when he told me she'd accused him of sexually abusing both of his kids, I immediately believed it to be a lie. This case here with Jarrod and his ex-wife and ex-in-laws, it's so familiar with what happened with my friend and what he had gone through. But Jarrod was luckier than my friend, though. Authorities believed him. They saw through Kelly and her parents' lies and dropped the case in 4 months' time. But now Detective Sorensen has this in front of him. The man that he'd cleared of charges was now dead just days after he closed the case. So because he had closed that case after finding no basis for the claims of sexual abuse, he had to wonder, was this murder the answer to their problems? And then something else happened following Jarrod's death. His daughter visited the forensic psychologist again, and in a follow-up interview that was conducted, this time she changed her story. Previously, during the official investigation, Malia had told the psychologist that her dad wasn't touching her inappropriately, but now, after his death, her story had changed and she said that he was touching her. And remember, this child had turned 4 the same month that her dad was murdered. And Detective Sorensen suspected, with her changing her story to match what her mom had said, he began thinking that Malia was being coached by her mom to say that her dad was touching her. And with that, it brought the detective to this conclusion, that Jarrod's murder had everything to do with his ongoing issues with his ex-wife. On top of that, what solidified his suspicions was the fact that it was the same evening that Jarrod was actually murdered that he had shown up to the local sheriff's office to file a report against her, asserting that he made the drive, which was about an hour and a half, to her house to visit with his daughter, a visit that had been ordered by the court, only to find that nobody was home. This had the detective thinking, did Kelly fail to show up for the visitation because she was getting prepared to gun down her ex-husband? It didn't take a genius to put it together. She was accusing him of abusing their daughter, allegations that were found to be baseless. She's in the throes of a fierce custody battle over Malia, and whoa, look at that. Jarrod winds up dead the night that she's a no-show for a court-ordered visit. Detective Sorensen is thinking she has got to be involved in this up to her eyeballs. So he hauled Kelly in for questioning the following day. When Kelly was brought into the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office to be questioned, she wasn't actually told right off the bat what she was there for. So she was playing it off, or at least trying to play it off like she's thinking this has to do with the complaint that Jarrod had filed the evening before, just before his murder, that she failed to show up for a court-ordered visitation. She was held in handcuffs for several hours, wondering why they were making such a big deal about this visitation. Kelly, too, was also interviewed on NBC, and even after she was informed that Jarrod was killed, she said she was still puzzled as to why she was there, because according to her, she didn't do anything wrong. She was asked if she was worried or scared, and she said no, she didn't do anything wrong, so she wasn't worried or scared in the least. Which, to me, I don't know. When I watched the interview, it was really disingenuous. How can you be sitting in handcuffs for hours in an interrogation room after having been told that the father of your child was murdered? How are you not scared as to why you're the one in handcuffs? But anyway, she told Detective Sorensen where she was, that she was at home with her daughter and I believe her boyfriend, that they barbecued, that they watched TV, and that she was home there all evening. And from all the detectives could find, her alibi seemed to check out. But that still didn't lessen his suspicions of Kelly and her possible involvement in Jarrod's murder, but for now, they had to let her go. They told her, maybe not in so many words, that they would be seeing her again soon. So a couple of weeks passed, and Detective Sorensen was growing increasingly frustrated with the way his investigation into Jarrod's murder was going. He was certain that Kelly had a hand in it, but her alibi was pretty rock solid. She was not there when Jarrod was shot and killed, and there was no way of getting around that. But even though he could not place Kelly at the actual scene of the crime, he was convinced that she knew much more than she was letting on. She had to, because she was the only person who really had anything to gain from Jarrod's death, the sole custody of their child. That's a pretty big deal. She had all the motive, but Detective Sorensen was unable to get around that alibi she had, so he kept digging. In looking into Kelly, Detective Sorensen learned that shortly after her divorce from Jarrod was finalized, that she and her parents moved away from Santa Barbara, taking Malia with them about an hour and a half north to a city called Grover Beach. Kelly and Malia did not live with her parents. She had her own apartment, but it was very close to their house. This move, of course, put a strain on the visitation, though it was only about 70 miles. I have read it was somewhat around 90 miles, so either 112 to 144 kilometers away, but still, that's not all that convenient. And I mentioned my friend who went through a similar accusations that Jarrod had gone through. The same thing happened in his situation, but it was way worse. While they were married, they were living in Helena, Montana. Without telling him, his ex-wife packed up her kids and moved 13 hours away, more than 800 miles or 1,300 kilometers to Colorado Springs to live with her parents. And when visitation guidelines were set up as they were living a couple of states apart, they were scattered throughout the year, obviously because weekly or every other week visitation was not feasible. But when my friend's visitation days did come up, he'd make that drive every single time. I remember him chronicling his trips on Facebook and how desolate it was to travel through those states. And it was rough, but he never missed a visitation. He eventually moved to Colorado Springs to be closer to his kids, and he has since gotten remarried. I've talked to him a few weeks ago, and the battle rages on from what he told me. So yeah, I guess for him, it's all going to end when the kids both turn 18, I guess. But anyway, the things going on with Kelly and her parents reminds me so much of my friend's ex-wife and the way things went with her parents as well. It's very similar. So Kelly and her parents, Mindy and Philip, the three of them, while they lived apart, they were in constant contact by phone, either by text or by calling or both. It was all the time, all day, every day. And I mean, maybe I'm not the best example when it comes to communicating with my mom, but even when you have a close relationship or loving relationship with your mom, are you really constantly on the phone with her? This stood out to Detective Sorensen as excessive. Her parents did provide childcare for Malia on a daily basis, I assume for Kelly to either go to work or to go to school or both. And according to Kelly's interview on NBC, just a few days before Malia turned 4, she and her parents, Malia's grandma and grandpa, sat with her and told her that her father was dead. She explained that they told her because they wanted to make sure that she was okay. That's how she put it. This part I kind of took issue with because what they did next was tell her all of the things that Daddy wasn't going to be able to do for her anymore. That she was never going to see him again, that there weren't going to be any more trips to the park, that there were not going to be any more visits to the zoo with Dad. And they finished it off by telling Malia that her dad was with the angels in heaven. I don't particularly have a problem with the adults in Malia's life talking to her and explaining her father's death to her, but telling her the things that they weren't going to be doing anymore and what wasn't going to be happening anymore really bugged me. I mean, they could have said, if they wanted to, after explaining tactfully what had happened, that there was an accident or something like that happened where it caused a problem with Daddy and his body wasn't working anymore and he died. And that we're all going to be very sad that Daddy isn't here to be with us and to be with you, and you might see us crying. And it's okay to cry and to be sad because we are going to miss Daddy very much. But it will be okay, and it will make us feel better to know that he's in heaven with the angels. But just because Daddy isn't here doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to do the fun things that you like to do with him. You're always going to be able to go to the park and to go to the zoo. Mommy will always want to go with you, and so will Nana and Papa. Will all be here for you. Something along those lines. But the way she said things just seemed kind of mean to me. But then again, who knows if they really cared. After all, Malia was already telling her dad that her grandma hates him. As the days and weeks passed and the investigation into Jarrod's violent death was moving along, Detective Sorensen had focused much of his efforts on trying to find a crack in Kelly's alibi. But no matter which way he attempted to dismantle it, the thing was ironclad. But there was something else going on in the background, really something that had struck one of the officers who had responded to the scene, and it was something that stood out to him. I mentioned this a moment ago. It was that potted plant of Persian violets. When he saw that plant on the ground, where it had fallen and come to rest between Jarrod's legs as he lay dead or close to death, the officer stared at those for a while. Why did that plant look so familiar? He knew he'd recently seen some plants just like those somewhere. As he stood there looking at the violets, it came to him. This officer, just days earlier, had gone to a local grocery store and picked up a bouquet of flowers. While he was looking at the selection in the store, he noticed a row of those exact same Persian violets, all in a row display in the floral area. So the first thing the next morning, that officer went over to that grocery store and visited that floral department again. And sure enough, the row of Persian violets was still there, but one pot from the display was missing. And it was really a lucky break that he made it over there, because certainly the employees that work in that department would have filled that hole in the display or arranged the pots so it wouldn't be a big missing gap on the shelf. But, this was the very next morning after Jarrod's murder. It had only been a matter of hours. He was shot around 11 p.m. And if that pot of violets was supposed to have been given to Jarrod as a gift from a student, then it most likely would have been left there not too long before he was killed. Remember, that evening he had been to the sheriff's office to file that report against Kelly for failing to comply with his court-ordered visitation, and that report was not filed at a sheriff's office near his house. It was filed at a sheriff's office near Kelly's house, so he had to make his way home. Still, we have to assume that when he got home, that plant had not been delivered onto his front porch. Otherwise, he would have picked it up and brought it in. That plant was placed on his porch sometime between the time he arrived home from making his report to the time that he was shot and killed. It got the detective wondering if the Persian violets were actually a ruse in order to bring an unsuspecting Jarrod to the door at that hour of the night, to bring him out into the open where he would be targeted for execution. So the officer asked to see the surveillance footage from the floral department from the night before, and he found what he was looking for. A woman was captured on surveillance video purchasing the pot of Persian violets. The video was time-stamped at 10:44 p.m. Jarrod was shot just after 11 p.m. From what they could see on the video, it was evident that this woman was clearly attempting to conceal her identity. She was wearing a dark, oversized sweatshirt. She had on a hat that was pulled down pretty low, just enough to allow her to barely be able to see, and her hair was tucked in. And it was clear in the video that the woman had her sleeves pulled over her hands and was holding the pot with the sleeves, covering her hands as to not leave any fingerprints behind. Detective Sorensen was sure that the woman making this purchase was Kelly. So he spoke to the clerk who sold the plant and was shown some pictures to see if the clerk could identify the person who made the purchase. And in the group of photos was a picture of Kelly, and the clerk did manage to narrow it down to one picture who most resembled that person who made the purchase, and she happened to choose Kelly's photo. As much as Detective Sorensen was ready to arrest Kelly for Jarrod's murder, he did need a little bit more evidence, so he waited. And just as it was a stroke of luck that one of the officers who responded to the scene of Jarrod's murder happened to have remembered that he'd seen potted plants at the grocery store a few days earlier that were exactly like the potted plant near Jarrod's body, this case received yet another stroke of luck. This time, it would be over in the lab where the items from the murder scene were being tested and processed for evidence, including that potted plant. And it just so happened that one of the detectives assisting on the case, once upon a time, had been an employee at a flower shop, and he knew just where they could look for important evidence when it came to the Persian violets. They knew that the purchaser of the violets had taken measures to prevent their fingerprints from being left on the pot itself. But what that person did not take into account was the evidence or potential evidence that would be left behind when it came to the "To My Teacher" card that was accompanied with those violets. And no, it wouldn't be on the card itself. The person who wrote that card was very careful about not leaving evidence behind on that as well. But rather, it would be that clear plastic stake, the card holder that is placed into the dirt in the pot that holds the card, addressed to the recipient. You see, when investigators watched that surveillance video of the woman purchasing the violets, they also saw her reach for a card and a plastic stake. She was careful about the manner in which she handled the card itself, just as she was when she handled the potted plant. But it was clear on the video that when she reached for one of the plastic card holders, she actually picked it up with her bare hands. The purchaser of the violets was very careful about not leaving any fingerprints on any of the evidence, and she either forgot or didn't think of it or didn't worry about fingerprints being left behind on that small, narrow, clear piece of plastic. But it wasn't fingerprints that would be lifted off that stake. it was DNA. She either didn't know or did not realize that when she touched that with her bare hands that she was leaving either bits of skin cells or sweat cells or both on that item, and it was swabbed and tested and DNA was recovered. Detective Sorensen was certain that he was about to nail Kelly for this crime as soon as he would run those tests and match that DNA from the cardholder to her. But he was sorely disappointed when the results came back, and it took about 5 months, that they were getting close to the Thanksgiving holidays by this time, when they got the word back about the DNA and that it was not a match to Kelly. It was a deflating moment for Detective Sorensen and heartbreaking for Jarrod's mother and father because they were convinced that it had to be Kelly. And now they feared, without any physical evidence tying her to the crime, that she might just get away with murder. So what did the investigators know about the DNA from that plastic steak? Well, for starters, the person who the DNA belonged to was female. But based on the genetics, it was clear that that person who left that DNA on the cardholder was also a close relative of Kelly's. And the closest female to Kelly in her life that would fit the bill was her mother, Mindy. They tested the DNA against a sample of Mindy's, and there they had it, a perfect match. The woman who had purchased that pot of Persian violets, the one who had picked out that "For My Teacher" card, and the person who had drawn and misspelled Jarrod's name on it, and the one who grabbed that clear plastic card holder at the florist counter in that grocery store, unknowingly leaving her DNA on it, was Jarrod's ex-mother-in-law. An arrest warrant was drawn up, and 6 months after Jarrod was gunned down on his front porch, Mindy Jones was being held in the Santa Barbara jail on suspicion of murder. Of course, Mindy denied any involvement in Jarrod's murder as she was being hauled off to jail. And while she was being taken into custody, at the same time, a search warrant was being executed at her home. They were looking for anything that would tie her to the crime. They searched for the murder weapon, any receipts from the purchase of the Persian violets, any clothing that matched what Mindy had been wearing on that surveillance video footage at the store, or anything else the witnesses who said that they saw the man and the woman running from a scene, any clothing that they had, but they failed to find any of that in their home. The one thing they did find that they thought might provide some leads or information was an address book that belonged to Mindy and Philip Jones. Investigators took that address book and called each number one by one to see who that person was, if they had spoken to the Joneses recently. And basically, they were on a fishing expedition to see if there was anything that they could catch. Eventually, one of the contacts in the book, a gentleman by the name of Richard Jordan, he hesitantly told investigators that Philip, Kelly's dad, not too long before Jarrod's murder, had called him up and asked him for his help in obtaining a weapon that could not be traced. But Richard said that he told Philip that he couldn't help him. And he thought that that would be the end of it. However, sometime later, Philip called him back up again and told him to forget that they ever talked about getting an unregistered gun, that it would seem kind of suspicious. So with that bit of information, police now felt that they had a case against Philip as well. That he would not be going around asking for an unregistered gun unless he had something to do with the planning that went into Jarrod's murder. The district attorney was satisfied that there was enough evidence to move forward with bringing charges against both Mindy and Philip Jones. They never thought that Mindy had done the crime on her own, but very much believed that she was the one leading the charge and that Philip was just doing as he was told, going along with the plot that his wife had hatched to get rid of Jarrod once and for all, to eliminate him from their granddaughter's life forever. So the theory is this: that Mindy had gone to the grocery store and purchased that potted plant with the intentions of using it as a ruse to bring Jarrod to his front door at that late hour of the night. While Jarrod wasn't exactly a teacher, I believe he was working on becoming an educator in some capacity in the field of chemistry. There was some talk of him having been in a student teaching program, and that may have been the angle when getting the pot of Persian violets to Jarrod with the card addressed to my teacher. After Mindy got that plant, she and Philip drove over and parked near Jarrod's apartment complex. Both she and Philip exited their vehicle and made their way towards his doorstep. Mindy went up to the door and placed the Persian violets on the porch and either rang or knocked on the door and immediately ducked out of sight, while Philip was hidden behind some bushes or a hedge nearby. And when Jarrod opened his door and he saw the violets on the ground, he bent down to pick them up, and when he came back up again, Philip fired one shot from his high-powered rifle that entered into Jarrod's chest, exited out his back, and traveled through his apartment, through the wall, coming to rest in the neighbor's bathroom. From there they fled, and the witnesses reported seeing a man and a woman fleeing from the immediate area after the gunshot was heard. The manner in which Philip and Mindy were accused of carrying this out, they were also going to be charged with the special circumstance of lying in wait, which meant, if convicted, they could be facing the possibility of a death sentence. But here is the question the prosecutor felt like needed to be answered. Why would Mindy and Philip, a pair of retired grandparents with absolutely no criminal history to speak of, suddenly decide to murder their ex-son-in-law? They were certain that it all had to do with their daughter Kelly and her custody problems with Jarrod. But because the marriage was so short and the custody battle had been so ferocious, so much so that unfounded sexual abuse charges had been levied by Kelly against Jarrod in what seemed to be an effort to clear the way for her to gain sole custody. What the prosecutor really wanted to know is how these two people, this young couple, how and why did things go so bad so fast? In looking at Kelly and Jarrod's history, it turned out the two of them really came from very, very different upbringings and families. They met in college, but the pregnancy happened so quickly and took them by surprise that they decided to try and make a go of it and to raise this child as husband and wife. So when Kelly was 3 months pregnant, they got married. But according to Kelly, things began going south pretty much right after Malia was born. And by the time she was just 8 months old, Kelly and Jarrod had separated. When asked about why things went so bad so fast, Kelly made the claim that Jarrod had been physically abusive to her. In her interview with NBC, she said that he didn't hit her, but she called it physically violent. She said that the night that she finally left, he had been so violent that it scared her so much that she had no choice but to leave, and followed that up by obtaining a temporary restraining order. Over the course of the next more than 2 years, Kelly repeatedly went before the family court judge and attempted to do anything and everything she could to prevent Jarrod from having any contact with Malia. But the judge shot Kelly's motions down time and time again, and eventually grew completely exasperated and fed up with Kelly's attempts at keeping Jarrod out of his daughter's life. So Kelly dialed it up a few notches and made those sexual abuse claims, and those were thoroughly investigated and ultimately thrown out with all of the other claims that she had made against Jarrod. Clearly, nothing was working. As a matter of fact, the prosecutor told NBC about an excerpt from one of the family court hearings where Kelly was harshly lectured by the judge. The judge said, "I severely question the way the mother is playing the game here. I question her credibility. I question her honesty. I question her respect for the court orders." And then the judge threatened Kelly. If she did not stop, she was going to remove Malia from her custody and award sole custody to Jarrod. To the prosecutor, after poring over all of the family court documents related to the custody battle over Malia, the motive for the murder became clear. Jarrod was fighting for full custody, and I mentioned Well, at least one of the reasons, because his daughter had told him that her grandmother hated him. But I'm sure with all the games that Kelly had been playing in the court and then putting him through a 4-month investigation, accusing him of abusing his daughter sexually, he had all kinds of reasons to try and get full custody. As a matter of fact, Jarrod had filed his motion to appeal the custody order that was in place, and they had a court date set for July 28th, just 19 days after his murder would take place. Even though Jarrod had a strenuous school schedule, he was working on his PhD at the time of his death. He was bound and determined to figure it out. He had no doubt that he was doing the right thing by fighting for his child. But was this a motive for murder? I have a little bit of a theory about this and the motive, and I feel like custody was just a part of it. I believe the motive was to gain full custody over Malia, but not to have to share her with her dad or her other set of grandparents. But I also believe it had to do with a deep hatred for Jarrod. When you look at pictures of Jarrod, many of them with his daughter, he appears to be just a regular old happy guy. By all accounts, he was generally a nice person, highly educated, a candidate for a PhD in chemistry, and really the only one who had anything bad to say about him was his ex-wife Kelly. And she was clearly discredited not only by her family court judge, but also the Santa Barbara Police Department after they had thoroughly investigated the claim that she had made that Jarrod was sexually abusing Malia. So what's with all the animosity towards Jarrod from both his ex-wife and his ex-in-laws? There is no doubt that the father-in-law was a part of this hate campaign against Jarrod, but the vibe that I'm getting as I read all of this was that he went along with whatever he was being told to do. So why all the hate on Jarrod? Well, I think it can be traced back yet again to another complicated mother-daughter relationship between Kelly and Mindy. There wasn't very much written about the dynamics or history of their relationship beyond the two being in constant contact and Mindy tending to be a constant presence in Kelly and Jarrod's relationship. And all of this played a role, if not a major part, in the reasons why the marriage fell apart before Malia had even turned 1 year old. Now, this is my opinion, and it's coming from some of my own personal experience, but I don't see Mindy and Kelly having a particularly close or loving relationship. I think the constant contact and meddling on Mindy's part was more about control than anything else. And I wouldn't be surprised if Mindy was a helicopter parent, and she and Philip had 2 daughters, Kelly and Callie. Kelly is actually spelled K-E-L-L-E, and Callie is spelled K-A-L-L-E. And I think Mindy probably had an authoritarian type parenting style. So once Kelly unexpectedly became pregnant and decided to give marriage a go with Jarrod, I don't think she was going to want to relinquish that control. And it's been said, and I mentioned it earlier, that this marriage was not between Jarrod and Kelly. It was between Jarrod, Kelly, and Kelly's parents. So how is it that Mindy could have such an impact on their relationship, on Kelly and Jarrod's marriage? And again, from personal experience, it's pretty simple. I've speculated that Mindy was an overbearing and controlling mother. I have an overbearing and controlling mother. Getting married was a threat to that. So either mom is going to have to conform to her new role and take a back seat in her daughter's life, or she's going to accelerate her behavior, which can very easily boil over into a struggle over who has the last word in every decision that's made. I'm going to guess that Kelly spent much of her life trying to please her mom. At least that's what it appears to be from the outside looking in, but that isn't necessarily what she's doing. If it's anything like the situation that I have with my mom, it's more of an effort to placate her, to keep her from becoming angry than anything else, not necessarily just to please. My mom is the type of person who used criticisms, put-downs, and threats to control my life. And for the daughter, the person who's on the receiving end of this, it's all stemming from fear. Fear that you're never going to be good enough, or smart enough, or pretty enough, or rich enough to ever do anything with your life. And if you don't do what your mom says and demands, you're going to end up a nobody with nothing. So you're spending your life trying to quote unquote please your mom because you're convinced you're going to be a failure without her. So when daughter becomes an adult and gets to the stages in life where she wants to get married and have kids, mom's narcissism cannot allow for any type of happiness or success to seep into the daughter's life because that weakens her stronghold over her. The daughter is finally going to be able to see that a decent life and a happy relationship is possible without her mother, and mother cannot have that. So in order to prevent that, mom has to first play along as if she's supportive of the marriage. I saw pictures of Kelly and Jarrod's wedding, her parents on her side, his parents on his side, and everyone looks happy. But that's part of mom's plan. It's a means to an end. Mom has to at least act like she's supportive of the young couple because her daughter's going to marry whether she likes it or not. But before the honeymoon is even over, she's going to begin her campaign to regain control over her daughter and now her granddaughter. But the complication is Jarrod and his rights as a father. Eventually, mom is able to cause so many problems between her daughter and her new husband that the fighting between them is going to be inevitable. And all Mindy has to do is sit back and watch the two of them destroy their marriage on their own. And with that, her plan worked. Now, this is all very speculative on my part, and it's based on my own experiences with my mom and how much my issues with her spilled over into my marriage. It's worth mentioning that from day one, my mother despised my husband. She pretended to be nice to his face, but she would speak so badly about him to me and to my daughter when he wasn't around. She just hated him. She still does. And he knew and he understood. He's not stupid. He knew that she didn't like anyone, so you can't take it personally. But man, she would call me up and yell at me or to pick a fight, which happened just about every single day. And it just didn't take a toll on me. It took a toll on both me and my husband. It was very, very stressful. So if the situation with Kelly and her mom is anything like the situation with me and my mom, the difference would be that I refuse to allow my mom to come between me and my husband. Looking back, I wish I had done more to try to protect him and my daughter from her manipulation and her control and her emotional and mental abuse. But there was still that part of me that thought I'd be able to make it stop if I could just do what she wanted me to do. Ultimately, she wanted me to walk away from my marriage, but that wasn't going to happen, at least not because she wanted it to happen. I also believe that shades of these issues can be seen in the fact that Kelly and her daughter and her parents moved about 90 miles or 144 kilometers away from Jarrod, but Kelly took up a place of her own, a very short distance from where her parents live. I get it, she's an adult and she wants to live on her own, and she has every right to want to do that. But the articles about this case said that her parents provided childcare for Malia every single day of the week. I moved home for a period of time with my daughter before I was married because it was a very similar situation. My parents provided some means of childcare for my daughter while I worked. I tried living apart from them for the first few years of Evelyn's life, but it was too difficult. The commute ate up much of my day. We'd come home just exhausted, so I decided to move home for a while. I avoided it, but things were still okay while my dad was alive. Once he died, that's when my mom's behavior took a complete turn, and it's only become progressively worse since. But anyway, I think part of the reason why Kelly opted to live apart from her parents had everything to do with this mother-daughter dynamic. And I'm really feeling that. My mom lives in a 4-bedroom house with an add-on in the back with her sister who she takes care of. She has mental health problems. I'm an only child. My daughter is an only grandchild. So when David and I separated, I could have moved there. I could have lived there for free. I would have been able to stay in California, but I'd have to sell my soul, basically. I opted out and moved to Nevada, where it was more affordable while I figured out what the heck to do next with my life. My daughter stayed. That's where she's at now. It's not easy, but she's more resilient than I am. I also needed to move in order to take care of my pets. I would not be able to have them at my mother's house. She would not allow them. As a matter of fact, shortly after I moved, my mom told me that I was wrong to leave California and to not be close to her and to my daughter. And I told her I still had my dogs to take care of, and she told me, get this, she told me that her brother euthanized his dog and it only cost $75, and I could take my dogs to his vet and do that. Yep, she said that I should euthanize my dogs so I could come live with her. Anyway, I'm sorry about going on so much about my mom. These are just my theories and why I think them. I just see a lot of similarities going on here with Kelly, the breakdown of the marriage, this perceived close relationship with her mother, and the reasons why Kelly maintained a separate residence from them if they were supposedly so close. I just feel a lot of my own mom's behavior in Mindy, and this is where I believe the motive for them to want Jarrod dead stems from. It's control. Murder is the most extreme act of control that one person could have over another, and it seems like such a dark place for Mindy and Philip Jones to have actually decided to go there. But I've said it before, and I'll say it again, people have killed for less. The payoff, Jarrod out of their lives for good, was apparently worth it. But anyway, sorry for getting off base there. I did have a point, I think. So, the problem investigators were facing now was that Kelly still had that solid alibi. When it came to her parents, they had an alibi too, and it was one that Kelly helped to corroborate for them. Mindy and Philip said that the night Jarrod was shot, they had gone for a drive up the coast, at least an hour and a half away from Jarrod's apartment. Kelly said that she called her mom that evening, and her mom told her that they were taking a walk along the beach, and that it was a really pretty summer night, and that she was certain that her mom and dad were on the beach because she could hear the waves crashing and the wind blowing in the background through the phone. At the time that this call was made, if Mindy and Philip were in fact at the beach, then, well, that eliminates the possibility that they were there at Jarrod's apartment committing that murder. Investigators weren't simply going to take their word for it, though. After all, there was nobody else in the world that had a grudge against Jarrod that ran as deep as the grudge that the Joneses had against him. There just wasn't anybody else. This wasn't a random drive-by shooting. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. The Persian violets and the card written out to Jarrod made it abundantly clear that he was targeted. So they wondered, were the Joneses really an hour and a half north of Jarrod's apartment taking an evening stroll along the beach? It didn't take very much digging for investigators to figure out that they weren't where they said that they were. The phone records of all three of their cell phones, Kelly's, Mindy's, and Philip's, were subpoenaed, and what they found was on the evening of July 9th, around 9 p.m., Kelly made a phone call to her mother's cell phone. That call pinged a cell tower along the 101 freeway. And for the time that they were on that call, and as that phone moved along, investigators were able to see that the phone was bouncing off towers headed in a southerly direction, in the direction of Santa Barbara, in the direction of Jarrod's apartment. So all three of them were caught in a pretty significant lie. And because Kelly had provided that alibi testimony under oath at a grand jury proceeding related to the possible prosecution of her parents for murder, prosecutors were more than happy to slap Kelly with murder charges right along with them, as well as charges of aiding and abetting. So with the three of them in jail awaiting trial, Malia was placed with her other set of grandparents, Jarrod's mom and dad, Susan and Richard. So this was a little bit of a silver lining in the tragedy that these folks had been put through. So as Kelly and her parents, Mindy and Philip, languished in prison waiting for their day in court, a whole new monkey wrench was thrown into the prosecutor's case. They came to find out that Philip Jones had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. His health was deteriorating pretty quickly, and there was no way that he was going to live to be able to be held accountable for the crimes with which he was charged. At least that was the thought at the time. It was very possible that either Philip would go ahead and take one for the team, fess up to everything, take full responsibility, and insist that his wife and daughter had nothing to do with it. It was neither here nor there for him, right? He was going to be on his deathbed. He'll take the blame so Kelly and Mindy would be able to go on with their lives. The prosecutor knew that if he died, it would dramatically weaken the case against Mindy and Kelly because they would very much be able to cast the blame on to the dead or dying Philip in order to save their own skin. So they needed to make a drastic decision, and they needed to act fast while Philip was still of sound mind. So Philip Jones was offered a deal, and it wasn't necessarily one that was going to fully exonerate Mindy and Kelly from responsibility for their part in Jarrod's death, but it would give them both the possibility of not spending the rest of their lives in prison. The deal was more for Kelly than for Mindy. Mindy was still going to have to face her own set of charges, including murder, and she would have to decide for herself if she was going to want to plea out those charges or to take a trial. The deal included the prosecutor dropping the conspiracy charges against Kelly, so she would be given the chance to plead guilty to the charge of accessory after the fact if he provided a full and detailed confession of what he and his wife did. So Philip took the deal. From his hospital bed, he provided that full confession, that he was the one who shot Jarrod as he hid out of sight from a distance with a high-powered rifle, that he had driven to the location of Jarrod's apartment the day before in order to determine where exactly he would be able to hide in order to get the best shot, and that on the evening of Jarrod's murder, his wife and he were not strolling along the beach, that they did in fact make the drive down to where Jarrod lived, that the rifle was in the bed of his truck, that they stopped at the grocery store near Jarrod's apartment where his wife went inside and purchased those Persian violets, and that it was Mindy who placed the violets on Jarrod's doorstep in order to bring him out into the open within Philip's sights so he would be able to get a clean shot. And as Jarrod stood there distracted by the violets, Philip fired one shot that struck him in the chest, killing him. When Philip was asked why he killed Jarrod, he said it was because Malia had told him that her father was touching her inappropriately and that he was afraid he was going to do it again. Despite the investigation finding no evidence that there was any abuse, Philip believed that there was, and this was his way of protecting her, that they tried other avenues. They had filed police reports, they had been to court repeatedly, they made reports to social services, but nobody was doing anything to help them or to stop Jarrod from abusing Malia. So he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. Those were Kelly's words in her interview with NBC. She said, quote, "The system let us down, and my parents felt it necessary to take matters into their own hands." So from what I'm getting from that statement is that this was all somehow okay in her mind, that it was okay for her parents to murder her daughter's father. She did follow that up with stating that she didn't think that her parents were really thinking clearly, but I think their actions on that night, the calculated way that they lured Jarrod to the door and lay in wait for him, that feels like clear thinking to me. It's very bizarre. This is a very, very weird family, these people. So there was this part of me that was thinking just for a second, what if these people, Kelly, Mindy, and Philip, believed with every fiber of their being that Jarrod was abusing Malia? It's a debate I've seen played out on social media a number of times. We have these predators in our society, child predators, who fall victim themselves to vigilante justice. Are people justified in taking the law into their own hands when the system fails them? Opinions are all over the place when it comes to how we feel about that. And can we really even say or know what we'd actually do if we were to come face to face with someone who abused our child and got away with it? If we had 5 minutes alone with this predator in a room, what would we do? I don't know what the real answer would be for me, but what I do know is it would not do me or my child any good if I found myself in trouble over a piece of human garbage. I think I would just rather be with my child than to be in jail for killing or trying to kill my child's abuser. But for this case, I set this line of thinking aside because I do believe the abuse allegations were fabricated either by Kelly or Mindy or the both of them. And there was a very real strong possibility that Philip believed the allegations to be true. But that is all I'm really willing to give these people when it comes to any sort of benefit of the doubt. Because the bottom line is they did not have the right to play judge, jury, and executioner. I just think I think her need for control eclipsed everything else, including her better judgment. Philip Jones was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kelly was convicted of being an accessory after the fact for her lies to the grand jury, and she was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The one person who was not in court on that day to accept her plea deal, which she would have been sentenced to 25 years to life with the chance of parole someday, was Mindy. No, she, out of the blue, decided to take her chances on a trial. She was slated to sign the deal along with Philip and Kelly, but pulled out at the last minute. So with that, Mindy Jones would be the only one of the three who would face trial. And what could she possibly have to say in defense of herself? Well, it was going to essentially be nothing. She was claiming a complete and all-encompassing case of amnesia. She claimed to remember nothing. She doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know who her family is. She doesn't remember being married or having children or a grandchild. She has no clue about anything having to do with any murder. All the investigators and the prosecutors, I'm sure, were in their offices giggling at the nonsense, but they believed it to be exactly what I spent a good amount of time talking about when it came to Mindy as a mother: manipulation. She thinks that she is the master of being able to manipulate people. She was able to manipulate her daughter for her entire life. She was able to manipulate her husband into committing murder. Now she was trying to manipulate the system. Before her trial even started in a preliminary hearing, the prosecution motioned to have any and all mention of the sexual abuse allegations against Jarrod to not be allowed to be brought up at any point in the trial. The allegations had been investigated and dismissed and should not be brought in as evidence in this case. And the judge agreed, barring any mention of the sexual abuse, thereby forbidding Mindy from being able to make the claim that she killed Jarrod as a means of protecting her granddaughter. That was a massive blow to the defense because that was basically their only defense. But on the flip side of that, the prosecution was not going to be able to accuse Mindy of plotting to kill Jarrod in a diabolical plan to eliminate him from his daughter's life. So with that, neither the prosecution or the defense were going to be able to say very much at all when it came to the motive for this crime, which the defense felt would have worked strongly in their favor if they would have been able to show that the motive for this was Jarrod's abuse. And on the flip side of that, how was the prosecution going to be able to convince a jury that Mindy killed Jarrod if they had no way of explaining why she would do such a thing? And another thing the prosecution had against them was the confession that Philip made, the one where he admitted to shooting Jarrod, admitted to being the one who killed him. They did have all of that on videotape while he was laying in a hospital bed, thinking that he was pretty much on death's doorstep. But as it turned out, in the time that elapsed from when he made that videotape and deal to plead guilty to the time that his wife went on trial, Philip's health had made a stunning turnaround and he was healthy enough to have been called to the stand to testify. Obviously, the problem here for the prosecution is that they have a person who's already been convicted and sentenced for the crime for which Mindy was on trial, and he would take the stand and testify to the court defiantly that he was the one that caused Jarrod's death, though he refused to label his actions as a murder. Pressed for an answer, he was asked, "Are you the one that killed him?" And he said that he was. The following information came from the court documents related to Mindy Jones's trial. Mindy's daughter, Kelly, got married to Jarrod in January of 2000. Malia was born 6 months later in July, but by March of 2001, the couple had separated. In 2004, Kelly moved with her daughter and Philip and Mindy into separate residences about an hour and a half away from Jarrod. Jarrod remained living in Santa Barbara at the time. He was in a PhD program at UC Santa Barbara and was working as an assistant teacher. On Monday, July 5th, 2004, 4 days before the murder, Jarrod was accompanied by his dad, Richard, and they drove together to Mindy and Philip's house after Malia had spent the weekend with him. However, there had been something unusual about this particular interaction with Philip Jones. In speaking to Malia and using a tone described as curt, in other words, kind of short and snippy, Philip said to Malia, "Say goodbye to your father." The reason why this was unusual is because normally Philip exchanged 0 words whenever Malia was being dropped off. Philip normally collected Malia, brought her into the house, and shut the door. 3 days later, on Thursday, July 8th, Philip Jones drove to Santa Barbara and took a look at the location of Jarrod's apartment. This was the trip that I mentioned earlier that was for the purpose of looking at the layout of the area and deciding on a place where he would lay in wait for the opportunity to shoot Jarrod from a distance. Friday, July 9th, 2004 is the day that Philip Jones and Mindy Jones chose to murder Jarrod. Philip had been the owner of a .30 caliber rifle that he kept stored in a closet at his house. On that day, he put the rifle along with some ammunition into his truck. He put on some tan coveralls over his clothing while Mindy wore a dark blue sweatshirt and a dark blue hat. They both got into the truck and made the 90-mile or 144-kilometer drive down towards Santa Barbara, southbound on the 101 freeway. On that same afternoon, going into the evening at approximately 7 p.m., Jarrod had gone over to the Sheriff's Department substation located in San Luis Obispo in order to file a complaint that he was unable to reach Kelly or see his daughter as mandated by the court order. This would have been the substation closest to Kelly's residence. A deputy from there called Kelly around 9 p.m. that night in regards to the complaint Jarrod had filed. Very shortly after Kelly hung up on that call, she called her mom's cell phone. This was a call that was pinging along the freeway, hitting towers as they headed south. Jarrod headed home, also along that same stretch of freeway that the Joneses were taking. As a matter of fact, Philip and Mindy reported that as they drove, they saw Jarrod pass them by in his car. They were both headed to the same location. Just before 10:30 that evening, Mindy and Philip stopped at a grocery store near Jarrod's apartment, where Mindy had gone inside to purchase that pot of Persian violets. She was very careful as to not leave any of her fingerprints on the pot or the accompanying card that read, "To my teacher." Intentionally, using messy and shaky handwriting, she misspelled Jarrod's name on the card in an effort to cover up their involvement. The purpose of the plant was for it to be used to lure Jarrod out of his apartment. After Mindy and Philip arrived at Jarrod's apartment, Mindy looked on as Philip loaded his rifle. She casually then walked up to Jarrod's front door. She put the plant down onto the porch. She knocked on the door and walked away. Jarrod opened the door. He looked down and saw the plant. He bent down to pick it up, and when he came up, Philip shot Jarrod in the chest. Mindy and Philip fled the scene as Jarrod bled to death on his front porch. A neighbor of Jarrod's heard the gunshot, and that was quickly followed by a man yelling, "Help, they've killed me." Several other neighbors reported hearing some loud noises around the same time. One neighbor reported seeing a woman wearing a blue baseball cap and a baggy blue sweatshirt near the mailboxes of the apartment. The witness looked on as this woman left the area right after the shooting, along with a man who was wearing a tan jumpsuit. The witnesses noted that the man in the jumpsuit walked with a distinctive gait. In fact, Philip Jones did walk with a pronounced limp. A second neighbor also witnessed a man walking away from the scene of the shooting in a tan jumpsuit, also with a noticeable limp. From there, Philip and Mindy drove to a nearby industrial area where they discarded the jumpsuit and the rifle into a trash dumpster. They also formulated their alibi, deciding that they would tell investigators, if questioned, that they were at the beach at Dinosaur Park, about an hour and a half away from Jarrod's apartment. Later on, Mindy bleached the clothing that she had been wearing that night and subsequently threw them out. The information about Philip asking a friend for help obtaining an unregistered and untraceable gun for him came out at trial. The friend testified that he told Philip that he could not help him. Later, after Jarrod's murder, Philip asked this same friend to forget about their conversation regarding an unregistered gun because it might seem suspicious. As for the trial, it was very difficult for the defense in trying to get the point across that there was a very serious and very valid reason for why Jarrod was killed without being able to say it outright, which they were not allowed to do. They weren't even allowed to hint at it. That the reason Philip killed Jarrod was to save Malia from being sexually abused by her father. The jury was told from the onset that they were not going to be given a motive for the crime, and even though the prosecution doesn't have to prove a motive, it was a little strange for them when considering the case. They had all of these facts, but they didn't have a reason why, and they really couldn't even ponder the reasons why. They just had to look at the murder for what it was and decide if Mindy was in fact guilty. Now, the jury did get the message, not in so many words, that there was a motive. The defense repeatedly attempted to dance around it, to make hints at it, to make veiled statements about it, and over again the prosecution objected. Every step Mindy's attorney made in that direction, the prosecution cut him off with their objections. And because of all this, the jury really felt the defense fell flat. When it was all said and done, they had not presented any sort of defense at all that made any sense. Mindy's attorney seemed to have no direction with his presentation, no real strategy to advocate for his client, nor did the defense provide the jury with fundamental, useful information for them to take into consideration when weighing the evidence in the case. Mindy's attorney didn't even really say anything nice or positive about her as a person. He never said that she was a good mother, a doting grandmother, that they had an idyllic family life, nothing of the sort. And everything her attorney said in the opening statements and the closing statements, none of that was supposed to have been factored into their decision. They had to go based on what was presented at trial. And as for Mindy, there just wasn't a whole lot in her defense. Her attorney would insist it was a great miscarriage of justice that he was not allowed to explain to the jury that she and Philip feared for Malia's safety, and that at most she would be guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder. Ultimately, in August of 2006, a little more than 2 years after Jarrod was gunned down, the jury found Mindy guilty on all charges. Guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of lying in wait, and guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Mindy Jones was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And with that, all three of them, Philip, Mindy, and Kelly, were all in prison for taking it upon themselves to decide that Jarrod Davidson had to die. In May of 2007, Philip Jones succumbed to his battle with lung cancer. 2 months later, on July 6th, 3 days shy of the third anniversary of Jarrod's death, Kelly was released from prison. Today, the only person still in prison who will remain there for the rest of her natural life is Mindy Jones. She is 65 years old. Malia was raised by Jarrod's mother and father. Kelly said she was going to try to regain custody of her, but it does not appear that that ever happened. As for Kelly today, well, there isn't a whole lot out there, but there is more than there usually is for some of the people we talk about on our show. From what I did find, Kelly has not had an easy go at it. She got remarried at some point to a man named Jay Dawsey, and it looks like together they had 3 children. In a December 2013 article in crimevoice.com, it said that Kelly's husband Jay was involved in some sort of attempted robbery incident. The article said that on December 30th, 2013, a call was made to 911 reporting someone armed with a knife who had broken into a home in Hemet, California. When deputies responded, the perpetrator was still there, and the occupant of that home had a gun pointed at the suspect while they waited for police to arrive. The man breaking into the home was then 32-year-old Jay Dawsey. While he was being taken into custody, he told officers that his family was at home, located down the street, and they were in some sort of danger. Deputies showed up at the residence and found Dawsey's wife, Kelly, along with 3 very young children. Nobody was hurt, but when deputies looked around the house, they could see that there had been someone who had opened fire with a gun inside the home, and Kelly and the kids were inside the house when this occurred. The rest of the house was searched. Deputies discovered a number of handguns and semi-automatic rifles, as well as a collection of drug paraphernalia. Because both Jay and Kelly Dawsey had prior felony convictions, this meant under California law that neither one of them were allowed to own a firearm. Kelly was taken into custody and faced 7 felony charges, including being a felon in possession of a firearm, 3 charges of felony willful child endangerment, and their children were removed from their custody. According to the court documents related to Kelly's husband Jay, he had come home that night on December 29th around 7 p.m. He was described as being agitated, feeling paranoid, and appeared to be high on methamphetamines. At the house with him was Kelly and their 3 children, ages 1 through 4. In an effort to calm Jay down, Kelly called her friend, a woman named Anita, and asked her to come over. Kelly and Anita attempted to talk to Jay to try and calm him down, to distract him, but nothing was really working. A couple of hours later, after being unable to de-escalate the problem, Jay went and retrieved 2 firearms, and one of them was an AR-15, a semi-automatic rifle that has been frequently used in mass shootings across the United States. While it is the most popular rifle in the country, it is rare for them to be used in crimes, as handguns kill many more people than AR-15s do. They have just been the weapon of choice for mass shooters, or at least some variations of this rifle. So Jay has these 2 guns, and he also armed himself with 2 knives. Around 11 p.m., Jay began discharging the weapon into the wall of the master bedroom of the home. The first shot he fired went through the wall and struck and shattered a fish tank on the other side. The couple's 1-year-old son had just been standing near that tank moments earlier. Everything from the tank spilled out onto the floor. Over the course of the next hour, Jay Dossie continued to fire shots throughout the inside of the home, while Kelly, Anita, and the 3 children took cover inside the children's bedroom. The shooting spree was all captured on security cameras that were installed inside the house. Around 11:30 p.m., Kelly's friend Anita picked up her belongings and went into the dining room area in an attempt to leave. She was confronted by Jay, who was still armed. She held up her hands and pleaded with him to not shoot her as he held his rifle pointed at her. Jay continued pacing around the dining room, and eventually Anita was able to slip out of the home. Jay continued firing more shots inside the house after Anita left. Sometime after that, the couple's 2-year-old began crying and stood in the doorway of the bedroom they'd all been hiding in with Kelly. Jay demanded that the child go back into the bedroom, and he continued firing his weapon inside the home. Around midnight, he stopped shooting. He told his kids that he loved them, and he left. When the home was later searched by law enforcement, bullet holes were found throughout the entire house, as well as bullet casings all over the floor. The area that had the most damage was in the hallway outside the children's bedroom, but the children's bedroom itself did not have any bullet holes in the walls or casings on the floor. After Jay left the home, this is when he went and broke into his neighbor's house through their window. He told the neighbor that someone was trying to kill his family. The neighbor held Jay at gunpoint until the sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene. Among the things Jay told responding officers was that he was high and that someone was trying to kill his family, which is what prompted them to go over to his and Kelly's home. When they searched the home, they saw the bullet holes and the bullet casings and the shattered fish tank. They also found 2 weapons that had been reported stolen, along with numerous other firearms and ammunition. They also recovered the video surveillance, which provided evidence of the entire shooting event. After a couple years of motions and hearings, including competency hearings, Jay was set for trial on January 24, 2017. But on that day, Jay decided to withdraw his not guilty plea, and he entered a plea of guilty on all charges, including an additional charge that he racked up after his arrest, where he attacked another inmate, causing severe head injuries that put that inmate into a coma, from which he eventually recovered. Jay Dossie was sentenced to 24 years in state prison. Today, he is 39 years old, and he will be eligible for parole in December of 2025. As for Kelly, I don't know what, if any, charges she was convicted of, or if she spent a significant amount of time in jail, but she is currently not in the California state prison system. I did find a link to her Facebook page. There are a few pictures of the 3 kids. They still look pretty young, like they aren't recent pictures of them. And there is no other information as to what she may be up to today. And I did read that she never did regain custody of Malia. As I said, one of the silver linings in the story, Jarrod's mother and father were able to raise Malia and launch her into adulthood. She would have turned 20 this past July of 2020. And that will bring this 168th episode of California Dreaming to a close. I would encourage you to come over to our Facebook discussion group if you haven't done so yet and request to join. It is there we discuss the cases that we cover. We share our thoughts and opinions about all of our stories, not just about the ones featured on our show, but any other podcast that you listen to. Tell us about some good documentaries that you've seen or book recommendations, as well as other current news stories that capture our attention. Whatever you feel like posting, as long as it doesn't have anything to do with politics or religion. You can go over to the show's Facebook page and like that page and leave a review or a recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to, with an eclectic roster of shows with content including true crime, history, sports entertainment, gaming, and social media. So visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You will find links to all of our podcasts, as well as a direct link to our merchandise store on TeePublic. Again, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams.